the pine-covered hills of western North Carolina, September 1947. While most girls her age were starting their junior year of high school, worrying about dances and grades and whether the boy in chemistry class might notice them, 16-year-old Eliza Crow was standing at the edge of a dirt road with everything she owned in a flour sack, watching the only home she had ever known disappear behind a cloud of dust. Her stepfather's truck did not slow down. It did not stop. The red taillights blinked once at the curve and then were gone. And Eliza Crow was alone in a way that most people never experience in their entire lives. The people of Hadley Springs would later say they were not surprised. That girl had always been trouble, they said. Wild, unmanageable. Her mother had died when Eliza was 11, and her father had remarried too quickly to a widow from Asheville who brought with her a new husband's expectations and no patience for a daughter who was not her own. When Eliza refused to quit school to work in the textile mill, when she talked back, when she failed to become the obedient household servant her stepfather believed all daughters should be, the outcome was inevitable. She was thrown out, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever she could grab in the 5 minutes she was given to leave. What happened over the next 3 years would become a legend in these mountains, a story passed down through generations, told and retold until some people wondered if it had really happened at all. But it did happen, every word of it. And if you are not subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because this story of survival, ingenuity, and one girl's impossible triumph over everyone who doubted her is something you will not want to miss. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from, and let me tell you about the upside-down cabin that made fools of them all. Eliza did not walk toward town that September evening. She walked away from it, up into the mountains where the roads turned to trails, and the trails turned to deer paths, and the deer paths turned to nothing at all. She had no plan beyond getting as far from Hadley Springs as her legs would carry her. She had no food, no money, no tools. She had a flour sack containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a photograph of her mother, and a Bible her grandmother had given her before she died. She had the knowledge of the woods that comes from growing up in them, from spending every free hour wandering the ridges and hollows while other children played closer to home. And she had something else, something that would prove more valuable than all the rest combined. She had a complete and total refusal to give up. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Eliza slept in rock overhangs and hollow logs, shivering through nights that grew colder as September wore on. She ate what she could find, which was not much in early autumn before the nuts had fallen and the late berries had ripened. She learned to identify the edible plants her grandfather had shown her years ago: wood sorrel, chickweed, the tender roots of cattails she found along a marshy creek. She caught a fish once by hand, cornering it in a shallow pool, and ate it raw because she had no way to make fire. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her clothes grew loose on her frame, and her cheekbones stood out sharp beneath her skin. She considered, more than once, walking back to town and begging for help from the church or the county welfare office. But she knew what that would mean. The orphanage in Asheville, or worse, being sent back to her stepfather's house, where the law said she belonged until she turned 18. She would rather die in these mountains than go back there. And for a while, dying in these mountains seemed like a real possibility. It was on the 15th day that Eliza found the place that would change everything. She had climbed higher than she had ever gone before, following a creek upstream toward its source, when she came upon a small meadow tucked into a fold of the mountain. The meadow was perhaps 2 acres, ringed by old-growth hemlocks and fed by a spring that bubbled up from the rocks at its upper edge. The spring water was ice-cold and pure, the kind of water that tasted like the earth itself had been distilled into liquid. Below the meadow, the creek dropped over a series of small falls before disappearing into a gorge that would discourage any casual visitor from climbing up. The place was hidden, protected, almost impossible to find unless you already knew it was there. Eliza knew, in that first moment of seeing it, that this was where she would make her stand. The people of Hadley Springs did not think much about Eliza Crow in those early weeks. A few church ladies clucked their tongues and said someone should check on her, but no one actually did. Her stepfather told anyone who asked that she had gone to live with relatives in Tennessee, and most people accepted this without question. It was easier to believe she had simply gone away than to confront the uncomfortable truth of what had been done to her. By the time October arrived, Eliza Crow had been largely forgotten by the town that had failed her. She had not forgotten them. Up in her hidden meadow, Eliza was working harder than she had ever worked in her life. She had found an old hunting cabin about a mile from the meadow, abandoned and falling apart, but containing treasures beyond price. A rusted axe head, a broken saw blade, a handful of bent nails, and a cast-iron pot with a crack in the bottom that could still hold water if you were careful. She carried these back to her meadow like sacred relics. She spent 3 days making a handle for the axe from a hickory branch, binding it with strips of bark until it held firm. She spent 2 more days sharpening the blade on a flat river stone until it could bite into wood again. And then she began to build. The first structure was simple, a lean-to shelter against a rock face, covered with hemlock branches and chinked with moss. It kept the rain off, mostly, and blocked the wind, sometimes. It was enough to survive in, but Eliza knew it would not be enough for winter. She had seen winters in these mountains. She had watched the snow pile up past the windowsills of her childhood home, had felt the cold seep through walls that seemed solid enough in summer. A lean-to would be a death sentence once December came. She needed a real cabin. And she needed something more. Eliza had spent her childhood listening to her grandfather's stories. He had been a builder, a craftsman who could make anything from wood and stone and determination. He had told her about the old ways, the techniques the first settlers had used when they came to these mountains with nothing but axes and hope. And he had told her about something else, something that most people had forgotten. The root cellars that the old-timers built, not just for storing vegetables, but for surviving the worst of winter. A root cellar, her grandfather had explained, stays the same temperature year-round. 55 degrees, give or take, no matter if it is blazing hot above or freezing cold. The earth itself is a blanket, he said, and if you go deep enough, winter cannot touch you. The old settlers knew this. They built their root cellars big enough to live in, and when the worst blizzards came, when the snow piled up and the wind howled and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in buckets beside the fire, they would climb down into the earth and wait it out in comfort while the world above turned deadly. Eliza remembered these stories as she stood in her meadow, looking at the ground beneath her feet, and she began to form a plan that would make everyone who had ever doubted her look like fools. She would build her cabin upside down. The concept was simple, though the execution would be anything but. Instead of building a cabin on top of the ground and hoping it would keep out the cold, she would dig down into the earth first, creating a living space below ground level where the temperature would stay constant. Then she would build a small cabin on top, not as a primary living space, but as an entrance, a workshop, a place to cook and store supplies. The cabin above would be tiny, almost comically small, barely more than a shed, but below it would be a warm, dry room carved into the mountainside, invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. People would look at her tiny cabin and laugh. They would call her stupid, call her crazy, say she would never survive the winter in such a pitiful structure. They would have no idea that the real home was beneath their feet. The digging began in late October. Eliza had no proper shovel, so she made one, lashing a flat stone to a wooden handle. It was slow, brutal work. The soil was rocky, full of roots from the surrounding trees. Some days she moved only a few inches. Her hands blistered, bled, calloused, and blistered again. Her shoulders ached so badly that she could not lift her arms above her head. She lost track of time, lost track of everything except the next shovelful of dirt, the next rock to be pried loose, the next inch of progress in her war against the earth. By mid-November, she had excavated a space roughly 10 feet square and 7 feet deep. The walls were solid clay and rock, naturally moisture-resistant. She had found, as her grandfather had promised, that the temperature in the pit stayed remarkably constant, noticeably warmer than the increasingly cold air above. She lined the floor with flat stones and the walls with cedar bark to prevent any seepage. She built a wooden frame over the pit and covered it with layers of logs, branches, and finally sod, creating a roof that was indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. From above, you would never know the underground room existed. The entrance to the underground room was through a trap door in the floor of the cabin she built on top. This cabin was deliberately small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with low ceilings and a single tiny window. She built it from logs she felled and dragged herself, notching them together in the style her grandfather had described, chinking the gaps with a mixture of clay and moss. The cabin had a small stone fireplace, just big enough to cook on and provide a little heat, but not large enough to warm the space in serious cold. Anyone looking at it would assume it was the home of someone very poor or very stupid, someone who did not understand what mountain winters could do. That was exactly what Eliza wanted them to think. Word of Eliza's survival reached Hadley Springs in early December, brought down by a hunter who had stumbled across her meadow while tracking a wounded deer. He had seen the girl, thin but alive, working on her absurdly small cabin, and he had hiked back to town full of stories. The Crow Girl was living up in the mountains, he told everyone who would listen. She had built herself a shack that would not keep a dog warm. She would be dead by Christmas. The reaction in town was mixed. Some people felt guilty, wondering if they should have done more to help her. Others felt vindicated, saying they had always known she was not right in the head. A few suggested someone should go up and bring her down before she froze to death, but no one actually did anything. The weather had already turned cold, and the climb to Eliza's meadow was steep and treacherous. Besides, she had made her choice. If she wanted to die on that mountain, that was her business. Thomas Barlow, who owned the feed store and considered himself something of an expert on survival, examined the hunter's description of Eliza's cabin and pronounced his verdict to the crowd gathered at his counter. He said the girl had maybe a month to live, probably less. He said that cabin she had built would not hold heat worth a damn, and once the real cold came, she would either freeze in her sleep or come crawling back to town begging for help. He said he almost felt sorry for her, but you could not help people who would not help themselves. Thomas Barlow would spend the rest of his life wishing he had kept his mouth shut. December brought the first real snow, 3 inches that melted within a week. Eliza barely noticed. She was too busy preparing her underground sanctuary. She had built a bed frame from cedar poles, strung with rope and topped with a mattress of dried grass and hemlock boughs. She had stocked the room with firewood, though she would need little, and with food she had gathered and preserved through the fall. Dried apples, smoked fish from the creek, nuts and berries, roots that would keep through the winter. She had a small oil lamp, traded for with a trapper who passed through in late November, and a supply of rendered bear fat to fuel it. She had blankets she had made herself from deer hides, painstakingly scraped and softened over weeks of labor. The underground room was, in truth, more comfortable than any home Eliza had ever known. The constant 55-degree temperature meant she was never truly cold, even without a fire. The cedar-lined walls gave off a pleasant scent. The oil lamp provided enough light to read by, and she had her grandmother's Bible to read. The silence was absolute, peaceful, a cocoon of warmth and safety while the world above did whatever it wanted. When she emerged into her tiny cabin to cook or to venture outside for water and firewood, the contrast was stark. The cabin was cold, barely warmer than the outside air, exactly as anyone observing it would expect. She kept up appearances, letting smoke rise from her chimney, leaving tracks in the snow between the cabin and the woodpile. Anyone watching from a distance would see exactly what they expected to see: a foolish girl slowly freezing in an inadequate shelter. January brought the storm that would make Eliza Crow a legend. It began on a Thursday evening, the sky turning a peculiar shade of green-gray that old-timers recognized as trouble. The barometric pressure dropped so fast that some people felt it in their joints, in the ache of old injuries, in a strange restlessness that made sleep impossible. By Friday morning, the snow was falling so thick you could not see 10 feet in front of your face. By Friday night, it had piled up past the windowsills of every house in Hadley Springs. And it kept falling. Saturday, Sunday, Monday. The wind howled through the streets like something alive and angry, piling the snow into drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero, then 20 below, then 25. Water pipes froze and burst, flooding kitchens and basements with icy water that turned to ice before it could be mopped up. Livestock died in their barns, cattle and horses and pigs that had survived every winter before this one. The old and the sick huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their wood supplies at alarming rates, rationing what remained and praying the storm would break before the last log was consumed. 3 people in Hadley Springs died that week, 2 from the cold and 1 from a heart attack while trying to shovel his way to his woodpile. The church bell rang for each of them, muffled by the snow, barely audible even a block away. And everyone assumed Eliza Crow was dead. Thomas Barlow said it with the confidence of a man who had been proven right. "That girl never had a chance," he told the customers who stamped the snow off their boots in his feed store. "That little shack of hers probably collapsed under the snow before the worst of it even hit. At least she did not suffer long," he said, shaking his head in a pantomime of sympathy that fooled no one. The storm broke on Tuesday, leaving behind a transformed world. Snow lay 4 feet deep on the level ground, deeper in the drifts. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the temperature remained brutally cold. It would be another week before the roads were passable, before normal life could resume. And it was during this week of recovery that a group of hunters, restless after being cooped up and curious about what the storm had done to the high country, decided to snowshoe up toward Eliza Crow's meadow to see what they could find. They expected to find a body, or perhaps just a collapsed cabin with the body buried somewhere beneath. What they found instead was smoke rising from a chimney. The hunters stood at the edge of the meadow, staring in disbelief. The tiny cabin was still standing, barely visible beneath a mound of snow, but unmistakably intact. And there was Eliza Crow herself, emerging from the door with a bucket, walking calmly to the spring to fetch water, as if it were a pleasant autumn afternoon, rather than the aftermath of the worst storm in 30 years. she saw them watching her. She raised a hand in greeting, a gesture that contained no desperation, no plea for rescue, nothing but the calm acknowledgement of one human being encountering another. Then she collected her water and walked back to her cabin, disappearing inside without looking back. The hunters returned to Hadley Springs with a story no one believed. The Crow Girl was alive, they said. Not just alive, but thriving. She looked healthier than she had in autumn, her cheeks ruddy, her movements strong and sure. Her cabin was standing, her fire was burning, and she showed no signs of needing any help whatsoever. People demanded to know how this was possible. The hunters could not explain it. They had seen the cabin, they said. It was tiny, barely bigger than an outhouse. It should not have survived the storm. And even if it had, the girl should have frozen to death inside it. There was no way that structure could hold enough heat to keep a person alive in 20 below weather. Thomas Barlow, whose prediction of Eliza's death had been repeated all over town, was particularly adamant that the hunters must be mistaken. He organized a second expedition, larger this time, including himself and several other prominent citizens of Hadley Springs. They made the difficult climb through waist-deep snow, determined to see for themselves what was happening in that meadow. What they found confirmed everything the hunters had said. The cabin was tiny and inadequate. The chimney emitted only a thin wisp of smoke, suggesting a fire barely large enough to cook on. And yet, Eliza Crow was not only alive, but visibly comfortable, sitting in her doorway mending a pair of deerskin gloves, while the visitors stood shivering in the cold. Thomas Barlow demanded to know her secret. He asked how she was surviving in that pitiful excuse for a shelter. He said it was impossible, that she must have some hidden stove, some supply of coal, something that explained how she was not dead. Eliza just smiled. She told them that her grandfather had taught her how to build. She did not show them the trapdoor. She did not explain about the underground room. She simply sat there, warm and calm and utterly self-sufficient, while the most respected men of Hadley Springs stood in the snow and struggled to understand how a 16-year-old girl they had written off as dead was making fools of them all. The story spread quickly after that. People came from neighboring towns to see the girl who had survived the great storm in a cabin the size of a chicken coop. Some came out of curiosity, some out of genuine admiration, and some hoping to discover her secret. Eliza welcomed them all with quiet courtesy, gave them water from her spring and warmth from her tiny fireplace, but she never showed anyone what lay beneath the floor. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the creeks ran high with meltwater, and the world turned green again. Eliza expanded her little cabin, adding a proper room above ground, now that she no longer needed to hide her survival capabilities. She cleared more of the meadow for a garden. She acquired chickens from a farmer who was so impressed by her story that he gave them to her for free. She built a life in that hidden meadow, a life that was entirely her own, beholden to no one and dependent on nothing but her own 2 hands. The people of Hadley Springs never quite knew what to make of her. Some admired her fiercely, holding her up as an example of what determination and hard work could accomplish. Others resented her, seeing in her success an implicit rebuke of their own decision to abandon her. Thomas Barlow never apologized for his predictions of her death, but he also never spoke of her again, changing the subject whenever her name came up in conversation. Eliza lived in her meadow for the next 63 years. She married once, briefly, to a man who found her independence attractive, until he realized she would never give it up. The marriage lasted 2 years before he retreated to town and a more conventional life. She had no children of her own, but she had dozens of what she called her strays, young people who found their way to her meadow over the decades, running from situations similar to the one she had escaped. They came in all conditions, bruised, hungry, frightened, angry. Some had been thrown out by families who did not want them. Some had run from situations too dark to speak about. Some had simply found themselves with nowhere else to go, and heard the stories about the woman in the mountains who had once been where they were now. Eliza took them in without question. She fed them, gave them a place to sleep in the underground room where she had once saved her own life, and in the morning she put them to work. She taught them what she knew: how to build, how to grow food, how to survive when the world offered no help. She taught them that desperation was not weakness, that asking for help was not failure, but that depending on yourself was a strength no one could take away. She was not gentle with them, not soft. She expected hard work and received it, but she also gave them something no one else had: the belief that they could make it, that they were not worthless, that their lives were their own to build. Most of her strays stayed only a few months before moving on, carrying with them skills and confidence they had not possessed before. A few stayed longer. One young woman, who had arrived at 17 fleeing an abusive husband, stayed for 3 years and became something like a daughter to Eliza. She was the one who eventually convinced Eliza to share her secret with the journalist. The underground room remained her secret for almost 40 years. She finally revealed it in 1987 to a journalist who was writing about Appalachian survival techniques for a regional magazine. She took him down through the trap door and showed him the space that had saved her life, still intact, still maintaining its constant 55 degrees, still lined with the cedar bark she had harvested as a frightened 16-year-old girl. The journalist asked why she had kept it secret for so long. Eliza's answer was simple. She said that the people who laughed at her deserved to keep wondering. She said that the ones who wrote her off, who predicted her death, who could not imagine that a girl alone could outthink an entire town, they did not deserve to know how she had done it. The secret was her revenge and her protection, and she had enjoyed every single year of watching people try to figure out how she had survived. She died in that meadow in 2010, at the age of 79. Her body was found by one of her strays, now a middle-aged woman with children of her own, who had come to check on her after a winter storm. Eliza was sitting in the rocking chair by her fireplace, a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, looking out the window at the mountains she had made her own. She looked peaceful, they said. She looked like someone who had won. The cabin still stands today. It has been expanded and improved over the decades, but the original structure remains at its core, including the tiny room that everyone thought was the whole house, and the trap door that leads to the underground sanctuary below. The current owners, a young couple who bought the property from Eliza's estate, give tours to visitors who want to see where the legend lived. They show them the underground room, explain how a 16-year-old girl with no resources and no help figured out how to survive when everyone expected her to die. The lesson of Eliza Crow's life is not complicated, but it is easy to forget. The people who tell you something is impossible are often the people who have never tried to do it themselves. The conventional wisdom that says you cannot survive, cannot succeed, cannot build a life worth living against the odds, that wisdom is often wrong. And sometimes the best revenge against those who doubt you is not to prove them wrong loudly, but to do it so quietly that they spend the rest of their lives wondering how you did it. Eliza never sought recognition for what she accomplished. She never wrote a book or gave speeches or tried to turn her story into anything more than what it was: a life lived on her own terms, in a place of her own making, owing nothing to anyone who had not earned her respect. When people praised her, she deflected, saying she had only done what needed to be done. But there was a gleam in her eye when she said it, a suppressed smile that suggested she knew exactly how remarkable her achievement was, and enjoyed every moment of not telling people the full truth. In the end, What Eliza built was not just a cabin. It was proof that the world's judgment is not final, that being written off is not the same as being defeated, and that the people who laugh at you today may spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how you proved them wrong. It was a statement about self-reliance and ingenuity and the stubborn refusal to die just because other people expected you to. And it was a gift to everyone who has ever been thrown away and told they would amount to nothing. The mountains of western North Carolina are full of hidden places, meadows tucked into folds of the ridges, springs bubbling up from secret sources, valleys that have never seen a road or a power line. Most of them will never be anything but wild land, home to deer and bear and the slow growth of ancient trees. But one of them, for 63 years, was something more. It was proof that shelter can be found where others see only wilderness, that warmth can exist even when everyone assumes you are freezing, that a life can be built in defiance of everything the world believes about who you are and what you can do. What would you build if everyone expected you to fail? What secret would you keep? What victory would you hoard if the people who abandoned you came looking for answers? Drop your response in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the hidden strengths we all carry and the doubters we all face, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this one every week. Stories of people who refused to accept the limits others placed on them. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is being told they cannot survive. And maybe, just maybe, they are already digging.